Hey, welcome to Pilgrim's Progress, part 2. This is stage 8. When they left the shepherds, they quickly arrived at the place where Christian met with Turnaway, who lived in the town of Apostasy. Therefore, Greatheart, acting as their guide, reminded them of Turnaway. He said, "This is the place where Christian met with one Turnaway, who carried with him the character of his rebellion on his back. And concerning this man, I have to tell you, he would not listen to counsel from anyone. Once he started to abandon his faith, no persuasion could stop him. When he came to the place where the cross and sepulchre were, he met with one who told him to look at them. Instead, he only gnashed his teeth, stamped his feet, and said he was determined to return to his own town. Before he came to the gate, he met with Evangelist, who offered to lay hands on him and to turn him into the way again. But this Turnaway resisted him. In fact, he showed much violent hatred toward him, and then made his way over the wall, and so escaped his hand. The pilgrims went on considering this, and when they reached the place where little Faith had been robbed, they came face to face with a man who had his sword drawn, and his face was covered with blood. Greatheart asked, "Who are you?" The man said, "My name is Valiant for Truth. I am a pilgrim on my way to the celestial city. Now, as I was on my way, there were 3 men who attacked me and offered me 3 options. The first was to join with them. The second was for me to go back from where I came. And the third was to decide whether or not I was ready to die right then and there. To the first I answered that I had been true to my faith for a long time, and so they could not expect me to join with thieves. Then they demanded my answer to the second option, and I told them that I had found no disadvantage in the place from where I had come, and that I had not abandoned it at all. It was just that I found it no longer suitable to me, and in fact very unprofitable for me. So I had forsaken it for this way. Then they asked me for my response to the third option. I told them my life was valuable and dear, and that I would not give it away lightly. Besides that, I told them they had no authority to offer such choices to me. I warned them that if they planned to interfere, they did so at their own peril. Then these 3, namely, Wildhead, Inconsiderate, and Pragmatic, drew weapons, and I also drew mine. So we started to fight, and it was 1 against 3. The battle raged for more than 3 hours. As you can see, they left upon me some of the signs of their valor, and I also marked them with some of mine. They just now left. I suppose they might have heard you coming, and so took off." Greatheart said, 3 against 1 were pretty great odds. Valiant for Truth nodded. "That's the truth. But whether great or small, odds are nothing to him who has the truth on his side. Though a host encamp against me," said one, "my heart will not fear. Though war arise against me, in spite of this, I shall be confident. Besides," he said, "I have read in some records that one man fought an army, and look how many Samson slew with the jawbone of an ass." Then Greatheart asked, "Why didn't you cry out, so someone might have heard you and come to your aid sooner?" "I called out to my king, whom I knew could hear me and provide invisible help," Valiant for Truth said. "That was sufficient for me." Greatheart said to Valiant for Truth, "You have behaved in a worthy manner. Let me see your sword." So Valiant for Truth showed it to him, and he took it into his hand. He studied the blade closely for a moment and said, "Aha! It is a straight Jerusalem blade." Valiant for Truth nodded and said, "That's right, it is. Let a man have one of these blades with a hand to wield it and skill to use it, and he may venture upon an angel with it. He has no need to fear holding it as long as he knows how to apply it. Its edge will never blunt. It will cut flesh and bones and soul and spirit and all." "You fought a long time," Greatheart said. "I'm surprised you didn't grow weary." "I fought until my sword clung to my hand. The 2 melded as if a sword grew out of my arm. When the blood ran through my fingers, I fought with the most courage." Greatheart said, "You have done well. You have resisted to the point of shedding your blood while striving against sin. Come, you shall live along with us, for we are your companions." Then they took him in, washed his wounds, and gave him what they could from what they had, to refresh him, and from that point they traveled together. Now as they went on, Greatheart was delighted in Valiant for Truth, for he found him to be one who worked well with his hands, who provided help to the pilgrims who were feeble and weak. As they traveled, Greatheart enjoyed his company and asked him about many things. He started out asking what country he was from. "I am from Darkland," he said. "I was born there, and my father and mother are still living there." "Darkland," Greatheart said. "Isn't that located along the same coast as the city of destruction?" "Yes, it is. And the thing that caused me to come on pilgrimage was this. We had a man by the name of Mr. Telltrue come into our area, and he told us about what Christian had done and how he left the city of destruction. He told about how he had left his wife and children and had taken up a pilgrim's life. It was also reported how he had killed a serpent that had resisted him in his journey, and how he reached his intended destination. Mr. Telltrue also told about the welcome he received at all his Lord's lodgings, especially when he came to the gates of the celestial city, about how he was received with the sound of trumpets by a company of shining ones. He also told about how all the bells in the city rang for joy at his reception, and about the golden garments with which he was clothed, along with many other things that I shall refrain from relating right now. In a word, the story of Christian and his travels, as I heard it, filled my heart with an urgency to follow after him. My father and mother wanted me to stay with them, but I just couldn't do it. So I left them, and I have come this far on my way." Greatheart asked, "You came in at the gate, didn't you?" "Yes, yes. For the same man also told us that it all would be for nothing if we did not begin by entering this way at the gate." Greatheart went to Christiana and said, "Look at how the testimony of your husband's pilgrimage has spread abroad far and near." Valiant for Truth looked at Christiana with wide eyes. "You mean to say that this is Christian's wife?" Greatheart nodded. "Yes, she is." He also gestured to the young men and said, "And these are his 4 sons." Valiant for Truth couldn't hide his surprise. "What? They are all going on pilgrimage too?" Greatheart smiled. "Yes, they truly are following after their father." "It gladdens my heart," Valiant for Truth said. "Can you imagine how joyful Christian will be when he sees his entire family, who wouldn't go with him when he left, but who will enter in after him at the gates into the celestial city?" "Without a doubt, it will be a comfort to him," Greatheart said. "For next to the joy of seeing himself there, it will be a joy to meet his wife and children there. As long as you brought that up, please, I'd like to hear your opinion about that. Some question whether we shall know one another when we are there." Greatheart asked, "Do you think when they arrive that they shall know themselves then, or that they will rejoice to see themselves in that blessedness? And if they shall know themselves in this way, why wouldn't they know others and rejoice in their welfare also? And since relatives are our kin, though that relationship will be suspended there, why wouldn't it be rational to conclude that we shall be more glad to see them there than to see that they are lacking?" "Well, I can see where you stand on this. Did you have any more to ask me about how I first came on pilgrimage?" "Yes," Greatheart said. "Were your father and mother willing to see you become a pilgrim?" Valiant for Truth shook his head. "Oh no, they did everything imaginable to persuade me to stay at home." "Why? What could they say against it?" "They said it was an idle life, and that if I weren't inclined to idleness and laziness, I would never tolerate a pilgrim's condition." Sadness filled Greatheart's eyes. "And what else did they say?" "Why, they told me that it was a dangerous way. In fact, they said that the way which pilgrims go is the most dangerous way in the world." Greatheart asked. Did they explain to you why or how this way is so dangerous? Yes, and they gave me many particulars. Like what? Greatheart asked. Name some of them. They told me of the Slough of Despond, where Christian was almost smothered. They told me about archers standing ready in Beelzebub Castle, prepared to shoot any who knock at the wicket gate for entrance. They also told me of the woods and dark mountains, the hill difficulty, of the lions and the three giants, Bloody Man, Maul, and Slaygood. And beyond that, they said that there was a foul fiend that haunted the valley of humiliation, and that Christian was almost killed by him. Besides, they said, you must go over the valley of the shadow of death, where the hobgoblins are, where the light is darkness, where the way is full of snares, pits, and traps. They told me also of giant despair, of Doubting Castle, and of the ruin that the pilgrims met with there. Plus they said I must go over the enchanted ground, which was dangerous, and that after all that I would come to a river over which there was no bridge. And they made sure to tell me that river was located between me and the celestial country. Was that all that they said? Valiant for Truth shook his head. No. They also told me that this way was full of deceivers and people who lie in wait to steer good men out of the path. A slight frown creased Greatheart's brow. But how did they know all of this? Valiant for Truth shrugged. They told me that Mr. Worldly Wiseman waits along the way, ready to deceive any who come along. They also said formality and hypocrisy are continually on the road, as well as others like Bians, Talkative, and Demas. They said if any of these met up with me, they would capture me. And if I escaped them, they said the flatterer would catch me in his net. They also told me that if I met up with green-headed ignorance, I would imagine I was headed to the gate. But instead, I'd be following him back to the hole in the side of the hill and made to go the byway to hell. I'm sure that was enough to discourage you, Greatheart said. Was that all they had to say? Valiant for Truth shook his head. No, there is more. They also told me about many who from long ago had tried to follow the way and had actually gone a great distance to see if they could find any evidence of the glory so many had talked about so much. According to them, those people came back again, saying they had been fools for taking one step on the path. Plus, they named several more who had done this, including Obstinate and Pliable, Mistrust and Timorous, Turnaway and Old Atheist. In fact, they listed several more, making sure to explain that some of them had gone quite far to see what they could find, but not one of them found a single advantage to following the way. Did they say anything more to discourage you? Greatheart asked. Yes, Valiant for Truth nodded. They told me about a man by the name of Mr. Fearing, who was a pilgrim, and how he found his way so lonely that he never found a time that he felt comfortable. They also talked about Mr. Despondency, who had almost been starved along the way. And I almost forgot this, but they talked about Christian too. They admitted that much talk surrounded him and his adventures on his way to claim a celestial crown, but that even he had almost drowned in the Black River, and that he never actually went another foot further following that incident. However, it was hushed up. Didn't any of these things discourage you? Valiant for Truth shook his head and smiled. No, not really, because they seemed all to be stories of no value, so I counted them as nothing. Tell me, Greatheart said, how did this thinking come about? Why, I still believed what Mr. Telltrue had told me, and that truth carried me beyond all the stories those scoundrels had to tell. Greatheart clapped him on the back. Then this was your victory, your faith in action. I believe you're right. My faith grew as I walked in the way and fought all those who assaulted me. And by believing, my faith has brought me to this place. Who desires to true valor see, let him come hither. Such a one will constant be, come wind, come weather. There's no discouragement that makes him even once relent his first declared intent to be a pilgrim, who hem him all around with dismal stories that themselves confound his strength all the more. No lion can cause him fright, he'll even with a giant fight, but he will have a right to be a pilgrim. Hobgoblin nor foul fiend can daunt his spirit. He knows that at the end he shall life inherit. Then fancies fly away. He'll not fear what men say. He'll labor night and day to be a pilgrim. By this time they arrived at the enchanted ground where the air naturally tended to make a person drowsy. It was totally overgrown with briars and thorns, except for here and there in the area where an enchanted arbor stood. If a man sat or fell asleep in this arbor, some say it raises the question of whether or not they shall ever rise or wake up again in this world. They went through this forest with Mr. Greatheart leading the way, for he was the guide after all. Mr. Valiant for Truth followed behind as a rear guard in case some fiend, dragon, giant, or thief should assault them from behind. Each man walked with his sword drawn in his hand, for they all knew it was a dangerous place. Also, they cheered one another up the best they could. Greatheart commanded Feeble Mind to come up behind him and placed Mr. Despondency under Valiant for Truth's watchful care. Now they had not gone far when a vast misty darkness fell over them. For a great while they could scarcely see one another. For some time they were forced to feel their way and call out to one another because they couldn't see where they were going. One might think it was miserable going for the best of them at that. It was even worse for the women and children whose feet and hearts were tender. But Greatheart encouraged them on from the front, and Valiant for Truth did the same from behind, so that they walked along at a pretty good pace. The way grew very wearisome and took them through dirt and mire. There was no inn or house in the area to feed them or offer the feebler pilgrims refreshment. For this reason, they walked along with much grunting, puffing, and sighing. One tumbled over a bush, and another stuck fast in the dirt. One cried out, "I've fallen down," and another, "The bushes have caught me and hold me fast. I can't get away from them." And another would answer, "Where are you?" Some of them even lost their shoes in the mire. Then they arrived at the arbor, which offered warm and promising refreshment to the weary pilgrims. It was formed of fine wrought iron with beautiful greens overhead, and furnished with welcoming benches and other seating, including a soft couch perfect for the weary to rest upon. With all things considered, you might think this tempted the pilgrims to stop and rest, because their journey had become fraught with difficulties. But not even one of them made a move to stop there. And from what I could tell, they continually paid attention to the advice of their guide, and he faithfully warned them of the various dangers present. Usually when they were nearest to them, the pilgrims boosted one another's spirits and encouraged each other to deny the flesh. This arbor was called the slothful's friend, and was made purposely to allure, if possible, some of the pilgrims so they would stop and rest when weary. I saw them in my dream as they went over this lonely, enchanted ground, until they came to a place where a man could even more easily lose his way. Now when it was light, their guide could tell them how to miss those ways that led them astray. But in the dark, the difficulties brought him to a standstill. He had a map of all ways leading to or from the celestial city in his pocket. So he lit a light to view the map or his book, which told him to be careful and to make a right-hand turn. And if he had not been careful to check his map, they would in all probability have been smothered in the mud. For just a little before them, at the end of the cleanest way, was a pit. No one knew how deep it was, for it was full of nothing but mud, and had been put there purposely to destroy the pilgrims who fell into it. I thought to myself, whoever goes on pilgrimage should have one of these maps with him, so that he may look at it when he comes to a standstill, so he can see what way he must take. Then they went on through this enchanted ground until they came to where there was another arbor, but it was built along the side of the road. In that arbor 2 men lay whose names were Heedless and Too Bold. These 2 had gone this far on pilgrimage, but after growing weary on their journey, sat down to rest and had fallen fast asleep. When the pilgrims saw them, they stood still and shook their heads, for they could see the sleepers were in a pitiful state. Then they talked over what they should do, whether to go on and let them sleep or to try to awaken them. So they decided to go to them and awaken them if they could. However, they approached with caution and took care not to dare to sit down or embrace any benefit offered by that arbor. So they went to the arbor and spoke to the men. They called each one by his name, for Greatheart seemed to know who they were. But the 2 men did not stir or answer. Then Greatheart shook them and did whatever he could to wake them. Without waking, one of them said, "I will pay you when I receive my money." Greatheart shook his head. "I will fight so long as I can hold my sword in my hand," the other said. At that, one of the children laughed. Then Christiana asked, "What is the meaning of this?" Greatheart said, "They talk in their sleep. If you strike them, beat them, or whatever else you do to them, they will answer you in this manner. A long time ago, one of them said, when the waves of the sea beat upon him, he slept upon the mast of a ship. When I awaken, I will seek it yet again. You know, when men talk in their sleep, they may say anything, but their words are not governed by faith or reason. Their words are incoherent now," Greatheart said, as he pointed to the sleeping men, "as they were between the time they left on pilgrimage and sitting down here. The harm of it is that when thoughtless, unobserving people go on pilgrimage, the odds are 20 to 1 that they end up like this. For this enchanted ground is one of the last refuges the enemy has to use against pilgrims. As you see, it is strategically located almost at the end of the way to be most advantageous against us. For the enemy thinks, when will these fools be most ready to sit down? It is when they are weary. And when are they most likely to be weary? It is when they are almost at their journey's end. Therefore, I say, the enchanted ground is placed so near to the Beulah land, so that it is near the end of their race. Therefore, let pilgrims be attentive and observant, or what has happened to these men here will happen to them, and none can awaken them." The pilgrims desired to continue on their journey, and with trembling asked their guide to light a lantern so they might travel the rest of their way with the help of the light. So he lit the lantern, and it helped them to see the rest of this way, even though the darkness was very great. But the children began to grow very weary, and they cried out to him who loves pilgrims and asked him to make their way more comfortable. When they walked a little further, a wind arose that drove away the foggy mist, and the air cleared. They could see that they were at the edge of the enchanted ground, and that they were within the way, walking where they should. Plus, now they could see one another better. When they were almost at the end of this ground, the continuous sound of a voice could be heard just ahead of them, and it raised much concern. They went on and looked for the source, and they found a man upon his knees, with hands and eyes lifted up. They thought he was speaking earnestly to the one who was above, but as they drew closer, they realized they could not make out what he said. So they tiptoed softly until he had finished. When the man finished, he got up and began to run toward the celestial city. Then Greatheart called after him, saying, "Hello, friend. May we accompany you? That is, if you are going to the celestial city, as I suppose." The man stopped and waited for them to catch up with him. But as soon as Mr. Honest saw him, he said, "I know this man." Valiant for Truth said, "Please tell me, who is he?" "He is someone who comes from the area where I used to live," Mr. Honest said. His name is Standfast. He is certainly a proper and good pilgrim." So they came up to one another, and Standfast said to Old Honest, "Hello, Father Honest, is that you?" "Yes," he said, "it is me." "I'm so happy to see you here," Mr. Standfast said, "that I have found you on this road. And I am just as glad I saw you on your knees," Honest said. Standfast blushed and said, "You saw me?" Honest nodded. "Yes, I did, and the sight made my heart glad." "Why? What did you think?" Standfast asked. "Think?" said Old Honest. "What could I think? I thought we had met up with an honest man on the road and should join his company as we travel." "It would have been wrong if you had thought anything else," Standfast said. "How happy I am! But I confess that I am not always behaving as I should, and I know that I am the one responsible." "You speak the truth," Honest said, "but your fear further confirms to me that things are right between the Prince of Pilgrims and your soul. For he says, 'Blessed is the man that fears God always.' Please tell us why you were down on your knees just now, brother," Valiant for Truth said. "Was it due to some special tenderness of heart, or did it have to do with a promise or oath?" Standfast said, "As you can see, we were upon the enchanted ground, and as I was going along, I thought to myself about how dangerous that part of the road was, and how many had come this far on pilgrimage who had been stopped here and destroyed. I also thought about the manner of the death with which this place destroys men. Those who die here don't die from a violent disease. In fact, the death which they die is not heavy or burdensome to them. For he who dies in his sleep begins that journey with desire and pleasure and submits to the will of that disease." Honest interrupted, "Did you see the 2 men asleep in the arbor?" "Yes. Yes, I saw Heedless and Too Bold there, and for all I know, they will lie there till they rot. But let me go on with my tale. As I was thinking about all this, I saw one woman dressed in old but very pleasing attire. She presented herself to me and offered me 3 things, that is to say, her body, her purse, and her bed. Now the truth is, I was weary and sleepy, and I had no money. I think perhaps the witch knew that. Well, I rejected her offer time after time, but she ignored my resistance and smiled. Then I began to grow angry. But that didn't matter to her at all. She made the same offers again and said, if I would be ruled by her, she would make me great and happy. She said, for I am the mistress of the world, and men are made happy by me. I asked her name, and she told me it was Madam Bubble. This set me even further from her, but she still followed me with the same enticements. Then, as you saw, I took to my knees, and with hands lifted up and cries, I prayed to him who said he would help. So just as you came up, the woman went her way. Then I continued to give thanks for my great deliverance, for I believe her intentions were no good, and that she sought to make stop my journey. Honest nodded his agreement. Without doubt, her intentions were bad. But wait a minute. Now that you talk about her, I think I have either seen her or read some story about her. Perhaps you have done both, Standfast said. Madam Bubble, Honest said. Is she a tall, good-looking woman with a somewhat dark complexion? Yes, you hit it. That's exactly what she looks like. Does she speak very smoothly and give you a smile at the end of a sentence? Honest asked. Exactly, Standfast said. You've described her perfectly, for those are her very actions. Does she wear a large purse at her side, and does she dip her hand into it, often fingering her money, as if it is her heart's delight? Yes, Standfast said. That is just what she did. You couldn't have described her more accurately if she had stood right here. Mr. Honest said, then he who drew her picture was a good artist, and he who wrote about her told the truth. Greatheart said, this woman is a witch, and it's due to her sorceries that this ground is enchanted. Whoever lays his head down in her lap might as well lay it down on a block over which an axe hangs. Those who look upon her beauty are counted as enemies of God. She is the one who maintains the great show of richness and elegance of all those who are the enemies of pilgrims. She is responsible for buying off many a man from a pilgrim's life, and she is a great gossiper. Both she and her daughters are always at one pilgrim's heels or another. They all commend and even prefer things valued and esteemed in this life. She is a bold and brazen woman who is willing to talk with any man. She always disrespects poor pilgrims and mocks them with laughter, while she highly praises the rich. For instance, if there is money in a place and one cunning enough to get it, she will speak well of that calculating person everywhere she goes. She loves banqueting and feasting as well, and so you'll find her always at one full table or another. In some places, she has told people she is a goddess, and for this reason, some actually worship her. At times, she even openly cheats and will declare that no one can demonstrate a good comparable to hers. She promises to live with children's children if they will just love her and make her important in their lives. If they do, she offers plentiful gold from her purse in some places and to some people. She loves to be sought after, spoken well of, and to lie in the hearts of men. She is never weary of speaking well of her wares, and the people she loves most are those who think best of her. She promises crowns and kingdoms to some if they will just take her advice. She leads many around with the halter and 10,000 times more to hell. Oh, Standfast said, what a mercy that I resisted her. To think of where she might have drawn me. Greatheart said, where? No one but God knows where, but generally speaking, we can be sure that she would have drawn you into many foolish and hurtful lusts, the sort which drown men in destruction and punishment in hell. It was she who set Absalom against his father and Jeroboam against his master. It was she who persuaded Judas to sell his Lord, and she who prevailed with Demas to forsake the godly pilgrim's life. No one can begin to understand all the trouble she causes. She brings about clashes between rulers and subjects, parents and children, neighbor and neighbor, a man and his wife, a man and himself, and even between the flesh and the spirit. Therefore, good Mr. Standfast, live up to your name when you have done all, and stand. At this discussion, a mixture of joy and trembling broke out among the pilgrims, but in the end they broke out and sang, what danger is the pilgrim in? How many are his foes? How many ways there are to sin, no living mortal knows. Some in the ditch are pulled aside, and can lie struggling in the mire, though some shun the frying pan, do leap into the fire. After this, I watched until they came into the land of Beulah, where the sun shines night and day. Here the weary pilgrims decided to rest a while, because pilgrims belong more to this country than any in this world, and because the orchards and vineyards there belong to the King of the celestial country. They were permitted to boldly use any of his things. After a short time they were refreshed, for the bells rang and the trumpets sounded a melody continually. Even though they didn't sleep, they were refreshed as if they had a sound night's sleep. Those walking in the streets raised their voices and shouted, more pilgrims have come to our city. One answered, and many have crossed over the river and were let in at the golden gates today. They raised their voices again, saying, a legion of shining ones has just come to town. By this we know there are more pilgrims upon the road. Here they come to wait for them, for we are ready to comfort them, following all their sorrow. The pilgrims got up and walked here and there as they listened to the heavenly noises filling the streets, while celestial visions delighted their eyes. In this land they heard nothing, saw nothing, felt nothing, smelled nothing, and tasted nothing offensive to their stomach or mind. They only tasted of the water of the river, which they were to cross over. They thought it tasted a little bitter to the palate, but it proved to be sweeter as it went down. In this place there was a record kept of the names of those who had been pilgrims in olden times. Along with this record was an account of the history of all the famous acts they had done. The topic of many conversations dealt with the river and its ebb and flow, and how this had affected pilgrims who previously crossed over the river. Some crossed over when the river was almost dry, while it had overflowed its banks for others. The children of the town went into the king's gardens and gathered fragrant flowers for the pilgrims, and with much affection brought them to the pilgrims. Aromatic camphor also grew here, along with nard, saffron, calamus, and cinnamon, with all the trees of frankincense, myrrh, and aloes, along with all the chief spices. The pilgrims' bodies were anointed, and their chambers perfumed, while they stayed there so as to prepare them to go cross the river when the appointed time arrived. Now while they stayed there and waited for the appointed time, a message arrived from the celestial city and created quite a buzz throughout the town. It contained an important matter for Christiana, the wife of Christian the pilgrim. The one delivering the message asked where she could be found, and he was directed to the house where she was. There the messenger delivered this message: "Hello, good woman. I bring you news that the master calls for you and expects that you should stand in his presence, clothed in immortality, within the next 10 days. When he had read this letter to her, he gave her a sure token that he was a true messenger and was come to bid her make haste to be gone. The token was an arrow with a point sharpened with love, let easily into her heart, which by degrees wrought so effectually with her that at the time appointed she must be gone. When Christiana saw that her time had come, and that she was the first of this group to be called to cross over, she called for Greatheart, her guide. She told him about the message, and he encouraged her, saying he was happy to hear the news, and that he would have been just as glad if the message had come for him. Then she asked for his advice as to how to prepare for her journey. So he told her exactly what to do, and that those being left behind would accompany her to the riverside. So Christiana called for her children and gave each of them her blessing, and told them she took comfort that they each bore the mark of their master on their foreheads, and that they had kept their garments so white. She was also glad to have them with her at this time. Lastly, she donated to the poor what little she owned, and commanded her sons and daughters to be ready for the time when the messenger would come for them. When she had spoken these words to her guide and her children, she called for Valiant for Truth. To him she said, "Sir, you have shown yourself true-hearted every place you go. Be faithful unto death, and my king will give you a crown of life. I would also ask that you keep an eye to my children. If you see them grow faint-hearted, speak to them and encourage them, including my daughters, my sons' wives." Then to Mr. Standfast she gave a ring, and she called for old Mr. Honest, and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." He said, "I wish you a beautiful, clear day when you set out for Mount Zion. I shall be glad to see you go over the river without getting your feet wet." But she answered, "Wet or dry makes no difference to me. I just long to be gone, no matter what the weather is like for my journey. I have plenty of time to sit down and rest and dry off once I get there." Then Mr. Ready to Halt walked into the room to see her. She said to him, "Your journey to get here has been fraught with difficulty, but that will make your rest all the sweeter. Watch and be prepared, for the messenger may come for you at a time when you least expect him." Ready to Halt left the room, and in came Mr. Despondency and his daughter, Much Afraid. To them, Christiana, she said, You ought to be thankful and forever remember how you were delivered from the hands of giant despair and rescued from Doubting Castle. The result of that mercy is that you have been brought safely here. With that in mind, be watchful and cast off your fear, and be serious about how you live your life. Never lose hope. Then she turned to Mr. Feeblemind and said, You were delivered from the mouth of giant Slaygood, so that your light might shine among the living, and that you would see your king and be strengthened. Only I advise you to repent of your tendency to fear and doubt his goodness before he sends for you, so you don't find yourself standing before him embarrassed for that fault when he comes. Now the day drew for Christiana to depart across the river. The road was full of people gathered to see her off on her journey. All along the banks beyond the river, horses and chariots gathered. They had come from above to accompany her to the city gate. She stepped forward and entered the river after saying goodbye to those who had followed her. Then she entered the river, and the last words she was heard to say were, I come, Lord, to be with you and bless you. Those who waited for Christiana across the river carried her out of their sight, and so her children and friends returned to their place. Christiana called at the gate and entered with all the ceremonies of joy that her husband Christian had experienced before her. At her departure, her children wept, but Greatheart and Valiant for Truth celebrated with joy on a well-tuned cymbal and harp. In this way, they all departed to their respective places. After some time, another message was delivered to the town again, and this time the messenger's business was with Mr. Ready to Halt. The messenger inquired about him and said, I have come from him whom you have loved and followed, though upon crutches. My message is to tell you that he expects you at his table to eat with him in his kingdom the day after Easter. Therefore, prepare for this journey. He also gave him a token to show he was a true messenger, saying, I have broken your golden bowl and loosed your silver cord. After this, Mr. Ready to Halt called for his fellow pilgrims and said, I have been sent for, and God shall surely visit you also. So he asked Valiant for Truth to make his will, and because he had nothing to leave those who survived him except his crutches and his good wishes, he said, These crutches I leave to my son, so that he shall walk in my steps, and along with them I leave 100 warm wishes, that he may prove better than I have been. Then he thanked Greatheart for his conduct and kindness, and then focused on his journey. When he came to the brink of the river, he said, Now I shall have no more need of these crutches, since across the river chariots and horses await for me to ride upon. The last words he was heard to say were, Welcome life. And with this, he went his way. After this, Mr. Feeblemind had news delivered when the messenger showed up at his chamber door. He came in and said, I have come to tell you that your master has need of you, and that in a very short time you must behold his face in brightness. Take this as a token of the truth of my message. Those who look through windows grow dim. Then Mr. Feeblemind called for his friends and told them about the message, what he was supposed to do, and about the token he had received regarding the truth of the message. Then he said, Since I have nothing to leave to anyone, what purpose is there for me to make a will? As for my feeble mind, that I will leave behind me, for that I shall certainly have no need of in the place where I am going, nor is it worth presenting to the poorest pilgrims. Therefore, when I'm gone, I desire that you, Valiant for Truth, would bury it in a dunghill. The day arrived on which he was to depart, and he entered the river just like those before him. His last words were, Hold out faith and patience. So he went over to the other side. Eventually, in the days after many of the pilgrims had passed away, Mr. Despondency was sent for, because a messenger had arrived for him. It said, Trembling man, you are summoned to be ready with the king by the next Lord's Day, to shout for joy for your deliverance from all your doubts. The message also said, And as proof that my message is true, I give him a grasshopper to be a burden unto him. Now when Mr. Despondency's daughter, whose name was Much Afraid, heard what happened, she said she would go with her father. Mr. Despondency said to his friends, "You know how my daughter and I have acted, and how difficult and problematic we have been for all of you. My will and my daughter's are that our depression and mindless fears would not be passed on to anyone when we leave. For I know that after my death, these evils will offer themselves to others. Let me make it clear. These are remnants of behaviors we entertained when we first began to be pilgrims, and after that, we were never able to shake free of them. After we depart, they will walk about like ghosts seeking to entertain the thoughts of pilgrims. For our sakes, don't let them do it. Instead, shut the doors on them." When the time came for them to depart, they went up to the brink of the river. The last words of Mr. Despondency were, "Farewell night, welcome day." His daughter went through the river singing, but no one could understand her words. Then after some time, another messenger arrived in the town, asking for Mr. Honest. He came to the house where Honest lived and delivered this message: "You are commanded to be ready in 7 days, to present yourself before your Lord at his father's house. And for proof that my message is true, I deliver this token. All the daughters of song will sing softly." Once he received the news, Mr. Honest called for his friends and said, "I am about to die, but shall make no will. As for my honesty, it shall go with me. Let any who live after I am gone be told of this." When the day of his departure arrived, he prepared to cross over the river. At that time, the river overflowed its banks in some places, but Mr. Honest in his lifetime had spoken to one Good Conscience to meet him there, and there he was ready to lend him his hand, and he helped him over. The last words of Mr. Honest were, "Grace reigns," and in this way, he left the world. After this, it was widely announced that Valiant for Truth received a summons by the hand of the same messenger. He also received a token that the summons was true, that his pitcher was broken at the fountain. When Valiant for Truth understood the message was true, he called for his friends. He let them know he had received a summons. "I am going to my father's. Even though I arrived here with great difficulty, I don't regret any of the trouble I had to live through to get here. I give my sword to the one who follows me in my pilgrimage, and my courage and skill to the one who can get it. My marks and scars I carry with me as a witness that I have fought his battles, and now he will be my rewarder." When the day came for him to cross the river, many accompanied him to the riverbank. He stepped into the water and said, "O death, where is your sting?" And as he went deeper, he said, "O death, where is your victory?" So he passed over the river to the sound of trumpets, welcoming him to the other side. Then a summons arrived for Mr. Standfast. This is the same Mr. Standfast whom the rest of the pilgrims found praying upon his knees in the enchanted ground. The messenger stood there as Mr. Standfast opened the message and stood reading the contents. The message told him he must prepare for a change of life, for his master was no longer willing for him to serve from so far away. This Mr. Standfast was put into a muse and thought quietly about what the message meant. The messenger said, "You needn't doubt the truth of my message, for here is a token of the truth contained in it. Your wheel is broken at the cistern." Mr. Standfast called to Greatheart, who was their guide, to come near. To him he said, "Sir, although it was not my fortune to be in your good company during most of the days of my pilgrimage, I have to tell you that since I met you, you have been beneficial to me. When I left my home, I left behind a wife and 5 small children. Let me request that when you return, for I know you return to your master's house in hopes that you may conduct more pilgrims as guide, that you send a message to my family and let them know all that has happened and all will happen to me. Especially be sure to tell them of my happy arrival to this place, as well as my present and blessed condition. Also be sure to tell them about Christian and Christiana, his wife, and how she and her children came after her husband. Tell them about her happy end and about where she is now. I have next to nothing to send to my family, unless it be prayers and tears for them. You can let them know about that if perhaps they succeed. When Mr. Standfast had set things in order, the time came for him to hurry to the river. When he arrived on the riverbank, the water was very calm. So when Mr. Standfast stepped into the water, he stood there for a while and talked with his companions who had accompanied him there. This river has frightened many, and I admit thoughts of it have often frightened me. But now as I stand here, I think about how my feet are standing on the very ground upon which the feet of the priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant stood as Israel crossed through the Jordan. The waters certainly taste bitter and feel cold to the stomach, yet the thoughts of what I am going to and the party that awaits me on the other side warm my heart like a glowing coal. I see myself at the end of my journey with my hard days behind me. I am going to see that head which was crowned with thorns, and that face which was spit upon for me. Until now I have lived by faith, based on what I've heard. But now where I go I shall live by sight, and shall be with him in whose company I delight myself. I have loved to hear my Lord spoken of, and wherever I have seen the print of his shoe in the earth, I have longed to follow in his steps too. His name has been as sweet to me as a honey pot, and more fragrant than any perfume. His voice has been pleasing, and I have longed to see his face more than most people desire sunlight. I gathered his words for my food and for antidotes against my weaknesses. He has held me and kept me from mine iniquities, and he has strengthened my steps in his way. While he talked about these things, his countenance changed, and he bowed and said, "Take me, for I come to you." And suddenly he could no longer be seen by those standing along this side of the river. Along the opposite bank, it was glorious to see the area filled with horses and chariots, with trumpeters, pipers, singers, and players strumming stringed instruments to welcome the pilgrims as they went up and followed them in at the beautiful gate of the city. As for Christiana's children, the 4 boys that Christiana brought, with their wives and children, I can't tell you about them in detail, for I didn't stay there. However, since I left that town, I heard someone say they were still alive and living life for the increase of the church in that place. In the future, if I have the opportunity to go that way again, I may give those who desire it an account of what I haven't mentioned here. In the meantime, I bid my reader farewell. The end of Pilgrim's Progress, Part 2. Thanks so much for listening. I appreciate you taking the time to do that. Your comments are always welcome. God bless and take care.